A note before this one begins. If you're the sort who keeps a lamp burning while you listen to these, you might find something in the audiobook collection. 3 volumes of these stories, read slow, the way they were meant to be heard. Not performed, just told, the way a person tells a thing they can't quite shake. You'll find the link below. No Heri. They'll wait for you. There are trails in the Appalachians that don't want to be found. They aren't lost the way a dropped knife is lost, or a fence row grown over and forgotten. They're lost the way a name is lost. Still there in the mouth of someone old enough to remember it, but quieter every year, and one day the mouth stops trying. There are people in the Smokies who still won't walk certain ridgelines. They don't put up signs. They don't tell their children why. They just don't go. And they don't talk about not going. And if you press them on it, they'll look at you the way you look at a door you've decided not to open, and they'll say something about the weather or the footing or the season, and that will be the end of it. They just don't go, and they've taught their children not to ask. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the fear of it, the deliberateness. Whole families, whole generations, choosing not to walk a piece of ground that their own people cleared, and never writing down why. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every one of these comments, and it always surprises me how far this voice carries. There's something in these stories that finds people in places I'd never think to look, and I've started to believe that's not an accident. If you've got a trail of your own, one your grandmother mentioned once and never mentioned again, one your father turned the truck around at, I want to hear about it. Write it below. It might just become the next story I tell. This one came to me the way most of them do. A name here, a detail there. A letter folded inside a deed book in the Haywood County Courthouse. The ink so faded you had to hold it at an angle to the window to read it. I've done my best to set it down true. The dates are real. The people were real. What happened on that trail, well, I'll tell you what was recorded, and I'll tell you what Enoch Saylor told his son, and you can decide for yourself where the two meet. It was 1912. Haywood County, western North Carolina. The mountains were still wild then in a way they aren't now. Not romantic wild, not picturesque, but genuinely indifferent to whether you lived or died in them. The roads were bad. The trails were worse. And the men who worked those mountains, the surveyors, the trappers, the timber cruisers, the preachers who rode circuit from one hollow to the next, they knew the difference between a trail that was difficult and a trail that was wrong. Enoch Saylor was 31 years old, lean and weathered the way a man gets who spent his whole life walking ridgelines, with dark hair that he kept cut short and gray eyes that squinted even indoors, a habit he'd never broken. He worked as an assistant to the county surveyor, which meant he carried the chain and drove the stakes and held the staff. He was good at it, not brilliant but careful, and careful is what surveying rewards. He had a lean face, sharp at the jaw, and a way of standing very still when he was listening, paying attention harder than most folks thought to. His father was Harlan Saylor, 68, stooped now in a way he hadn't been even 2 years before, with white hair that had gone thin and hands that trembled when he tried to hold a cup. Harlan had been a trailman his whole life. Not a surveyor, not a trapper, but something between a guide and a walker, a man who knew the old paths the way some men know scripture. He could tell you where a man ought to turn back. That knowledge was going now the way frost leaves a field. Harlan would start a sentence about a trail and stop in the middle, his eyes going soft and distant. He was embarrassed to be losing the thing he was best at. Enoch's sister Marianne, 34, broad-shouldered and practical, with their father's dark hair gone prematurely gray at the temples, kept house for Harlan in the old cabin on Pinewood Creek. She thought Enoch's trail walking was a waste of good daylight. She said so often. He doesn't need you to walk those trails, Enoch. He needs you to sit with him. And she was right, and Enoch knew she was right, and he went anyway because what he was doing wasn't really about the trails. It was about getting the knowledge out of Harlan's head and onto paper before it was gone. Every trail the old man could still describe, Enoch walked and mapped and measured, and he wrote it down in a leather-bound survey book with the care of a man copying scripture. He was racing his father's memory, and he knew he was losing. He'd heard about the Pinewood Trace from an old deed book, a trail referenced in an 1847 land transfer, described as the trace leading from Pinewood Creek over the forked ridge to the Cataloochee Valley. The deed noted, in handwriting that was careful and small, trail vacated. No cause recorded. That was all. No explanation. No petition. No record of who vacated it or why. Just a note in a margin and then silence. Enoch asked his father about it. Harlan went very still, the way he did when he was listening, and then he said, "I walked it once. With your mother. Before you were born." Enoch waited for more, but there wasn't more. Harlan's eyes had gone soft and distant, and whatever else he'd been about to say was already gone. Enoch asked around. He asked at the general store in Mount Sterling, where the trappers came to trade. He asked Willard Coots, 56, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with a red beard gone to rust and gray and hands like carved oak, a man who'd trapped the Cataloochee Valley for 30 years. Willard was not a man who frightened easily. When Enoch asked him about the Pinewood Trace, Willard set his coffee down and looked at him for a long time. "I know where it is," Willard said. "I've been to the mouth of it. I don't go past the first bend, and I won't." "Why?" Willard picked his coffee back up. "Because I'm not a fool, Enoch. And I'm not going to tell you why, because you'd go look, and I'd have to come find what's left of you." He brought his dog. Bess was a blue-tick coonhound, 8 years old, gray-muzzled and deep-chested. A dog that had treed more raccoons than Enoch could count, and had once held a boar at bay for 40 minutes while Enoch reloaded. Bess was not a nervous dog. She was, in Enoch's estimation, the most reliable thing in his life, more reliable than his own 2 legs. The first day was a Thursday in early September. Enoch found the trailhead where the deed book said it would be. A gap in the rhododendron on the north side of Pinewood Creek, just past where the creek made a sharp bend to the east. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to walk single file, and the ground inside it was smooth and bare, leaf-covered with no undergrowth. That was wrong. An unmaintained trail should have been grown over within a season. This one was clear, as if someone was walking it still. Bess stopped at the gap. She didn't whine. She didn't growl. She just stopped, the way a dog stops when she's been told to sit, except no one had told her. She stood at the edge of the rhododendron and looked into the gap, and her ears were forward and her tail was level, and she did not move. "Bess." She looked at him, looked back at the gap, did not move. Enoch went in alone. The trail descended steadily to the south, following a ravine that deepened. The canopy was thick, poplar and hemlock and birch, the light coming through in coins and strips. The footing was good. The air was cooler than it should have been for September, and it smelled of wet stone, though there was no water he could hear. He counted the switchbacks as he went, a surveyor's habit. The trail turned 7 times. 7 switchbacks, each one cutting back against the slope, each one descending. He marked each with a red survey flag tied to a branch. 7 flags. 7 turns. He reached the bottom where the trail crossed a dry creek bed, and he turned around and came back. 7 going down. He wrote it in his book. 7 switchbacks, each marked, each flagged. He came out of the gap and Bess was sitting where he'd left her. Exactly where he'd left her, and she stood up and pressed against his leg hard, the way she did when she wanted to be reassured about something. He scratched her ears and told her she was a good dog, and they walked home. The 3rd day was a Saturday. Enoch went back. Bess came with him this time. He'd had to coax her, which was new, which he'd never had to do, but she came, and she walked at his heel with her head low and her ears flat, which was not her way. Her way was to range ahead, nose down, tail up, working the edges of the trail. Today she stayed close. Today she pressed against his boot with every step. He found his flags, all 7 still tied to their branches. He started walking south again, counting. 7 switchbacks, 7 flags. He reached the bottom, crossed the dry creek bed, and turned around. He counted on the way back. That was habit too. You always counted both ways. You checked your work. The first switchback. The second. The third. He passed his 3rd flag. The 4th. The 5th. He passed his 5th flag. The 6th. The 7th. He passed his 7th flag. The 8th. He stopped. He was still on the trail. He could see the gap ahead, the light coming through the rhododendron. He could see Bess sitting at the trailhead, waiting. But the trail between him and the gap had turned and turned again, and he had counted 8 switchbacks, and there were only 7 flags, and the flags were in the right places, but the turns between them were wrong. There were more turns than flags. The trail had bent in places where it hadn't bent before. 7 going down. 11 coming back. He stood there with his survey book open and his pencil in his hand, and he wrote it down because that's what a careful man does. He writes it down and he doesn't explain it and he keeps walking. He walked out, Bess pressed against his leg. He counted his steps on the way home, which he'd never done before, which he would do for the rest of his life. 7 going down. 11 coming back. The 5th day was a Monday. Enoch brought Willard Coots. He didn't tell Willard what he'd found. He just asked him to walk the trail with him, to see the old trace, and Willard looked at him with those flat, careful eyes and said, "You went past the first bend, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Enoch didn't answer. Willard came anyway because that's what men in those mountains did for each other. They came when you asked, even when they knew they shouldn't. Bess came too. She walked between them, her head low, her tail tucked, and at the gap she stopped again, the same as before, and this time she whined. It was a low, continuous sound, not loud, barely audible. The kind of whine a dog makes when she's trying to tell you something she doesn't have words for. Enoch told her to stay. She lay down at the trailhead and put her chin on her paws and watched them go. Willard made it to the first switchback. He stopped. He stood with his head tilted, listening for something, and Enoch watched the color leave his face. Slowly, the way it goes when a man is controlling himself, fighting something back. What was left was a gray, washed-out Willard Coots, standing on a perfectly good trail on a clear morning, looking like he'd seen something that wasn't there. "I'm done," Willard said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. "I'm going back to Bess. You do what you're going to do, Enoch. But I'm done." He turned around and walked out without looking back. Enoch noticed he walked faster going out than coming in, and that he counted under his breath as he went. Enoch continued alone. He walked south counting. 7 switchbacks, 7 flags. He reached the bottom, crossed the dry creek bed, turned around. He walked north counting. 11 switchbacks, 7 flags. For turns with no flags. For bends that existed in one direction and not the other. He stopped at each unflagged bend and looked at the ground, at the trail, at the trees. The trail was real. The footing was solid. The rhododendron was cut back the way it would be if someone had been maintaining it. But there was no flag because the bend hadn't been there 2 days ago when he'd walked the other way. 7 going down. 11 coming back. The 7th day was a Wednesday. Enoch went alone. He brought his survey chain, a 100-foot linked steel chain, heavy, the kind that didn't lie. He brought his compass, a good one, a girly transit compass with a brass housing that he'd calibrated himself. He brought a bag of smooth river stones, 20 of them, each one about the size of a fist, and he dropped one at every switchback as he walked south. 7 stones. 7 switchbacks. He measured the trail's length with the chain as he went. 2 chains and 30 feet. 230 feet. He wrote it down. At the bottom, he turned around. He walked north. He counted the stones. The first stone was there. The second stone was there. The third was gone. The fourth had moved 3 feet to the left, sitting in the rhododendron. The fifth was gone. The sixth was there. The seventh was gone. 4 stones remained. 3 were missing. And the trail had 11 switchbacks, and he measured it with the chain as he went, and the length was 3 chains and 70 feet. 370 feet. The same path, the same ground, the same trees on either side, and it was 140 feet longer going north than going south. The compass wasn't right. The needle didn't settle. It swung slow and wide, the way a needle swings when there's iron in the ground, except there wasn't iron in the ground. The geology was sandstone and schist, nothing magnetic. The needle swung and didn't settle, and he stood on a trail that was longer in one direction than the other, with stones that moved and stones that vanished, and he wrote it all down because that's what a careful man does. 7 going down. 11 coming back. The 9th day was a Friday. Enoch went to see Asaph Cruz. Asaph Cruz was 63 years old, though he looked older. A thin man with a deeply lined face and white hair that he kept covered with a wide-brimmed felt hat that had been reshaped so many times it no longer remembered its original crown. He had pale blue eyes, watery and red-rimmed, and a long, narrow nose that had been broken twice, and he walked with a hickory stick that he used less for balance than for punctuation. Tapping it when he wanted you to listen, striking it against the porch rail when he wanted you to understand. He'd been a circuit preacher for 37 years, riding the hollows from Cataloochee to Cosby, and before that a schoolteacher, and before that a boy who walked the mountains with his grandmother, who was Cherokee, and who had taught him things the church didn't teach. He lived alone now in a one-room cabin on the east fork of Cataloochee Creek. His wife 10 years dead. His children grown and gone. He kept a garden. He read his Bible. He waited for Sunday. Enoch found him on his porch, shelling beans. The day was overcast, the light flat and gray. Enoch sat down on the step and told him about the trail. He told him about the switchbacks, the flags, the stones, the chain measurements. He told him the numbers Asaph respected numbers who'd taught arithmetic for 15 years. He told him about the compass needle that wouldn't settle. He told him about Bess. Asaph shelled beans and listened. He didn't interrupt. When Enoch was finished, Asaph set the bowl aside and tapped his hickory stick against the porch boards. My grandmother walked that trace, Asaph said. She walked it once. She said it was the longest short trail she'd ever been on. She said it took her a morning to walk down and 2 days to walk back, and she was a fast walker and she hadn't rested between and she hadn't gotten lost. 2 days, Enoch said. 2 days. The same trail. The same ground. She said she counted her steps going down and she counted them coming back, and the numbers weren't the same, and she said it wasn't that she'd lost count. She said the trail had more steps in it coming back than going down. She said it was as if the mountain had decided she needed to walk longer to leave than she'd needed to walk to arrive. Enoch sat with that. The beans clicked in the bowl where Asaph had set it, settling against each other, and the clouds moved behind the mountains, slow and low. She said something else, Asaph said. He tapped his stick again. She said the trail knows when you've turned around. She said it knows you've decided to leave and it doesn't like it. She said it doesn't stop you. It just makes leaving take longer than arriving. She said if you go too far, it makes leaving take longer than you have. How far is too far? Asaph looked at him. His pale blue eyes were steady, and there was no menace in them, only an old, tired knowledge, the kind that comes from having lived long enough to stop arguing with the things you know. She didn't say. She said she'd gone to the second creek, a running creek past the dry bed, and she'd drunk from it, and that was when she turned around. If she'd gone past the second creek, she wouldn't have come back. Is there a second creek? I don't know. I never walked it. She told me not to. She told me, and I've told my children, and they'll tell theirs, and that's all we can do. We can tell them. We can't make them listen. Asaph picked up his bowl and went back to shelling beans. Enoch sat on the step for a long time after that, watching the clouds, watching the mountains, thinking about a trail that knew when you turned around. Has anyone ever gone past the second creek? Enoch asked. Asaph didn't look up. 3 men that I know of. One was my grandmother's cousin. His name was Standing Deer. He went in 1809. He was a trapper. He was 22. He never came out. And the other 2. A timber cruiser named Jackson Blevins went in 1867, looking for standing timber on the far side of the ridge. He was 40, strong, experienced. He told his wife he'd be back for supper. She waited 3 years. And the third? Asaph set the bowl down again. He turned in his chair and looked at Enoch directly, and his expression was the expression of a man who has carried a weight for a long time and is deciding whether to set it down. The third was a surveyor. Like you. A county man. He went in 1847. He went to map the trace because the county wanted it on record. He went with his chain and his compass and his flags. His name was Gilmer Haynes. He was 28. He wrote in his book that the trail had 7 switchbacks going down and 11 coming back. He wrote it 3 times. He wrote that his compass wouldn't settle. He wrote that his stones had moved. Enoch's hands went cold. The air was cool on the porch, but his hands went cold from the inside, the way they do when something you've been telling yourself is your own discovery turns out to be someone else's. Someone who came before you and wrote down the same numbers in the same book. What happened to him? He sent his book out. He gave it to a boy at the trailhead, a local boy, and told him to take it to the courthouse. The boy brought it. That's how the note ended up in the deed book, the one you found. Trail vacated. No cause recorded. They recorded it as vacated because there was no one left to walk it. Gilmer Haynes went back in. He went back in on a Wednesday. He told the boy he was going to measure the second creek. He didn't come out. The book, Enoch said. The survey book. Where is it? Asaph tapped his stick. I have it. My grandmother kept it. She said a thing like that shouldn't be lost, even if the man who wrote it was. He went inside and came back with a leather-bound survey book, cracked and dark with age. Enoch opened it. The handwriting was small and careful. September 14th, 1847. Pinewood Trace. 7 switchbacks south. Flags placed. Chain measured 230 feet. And below that, the same words Enoch had written in his own book 65 years later. 7 going down. 11 coming back. Have you ever known something in your body before your mind caught up? Not a thought. Not a suspicion. A thing your skin knew, your hands knew, the small hairs on your arms knew, while your brain was still lining up its reasons. Maybe you've walked into a room and known, before you saw anything, before you heard anything, that something in that room was wrong. Maybe you've stood at a trailhead or a doorway or the edge of a field, and your legs have refused to go forward and you couldn't explain it and you told yourself you were being foolish and you went forward anyway and later you wished you hadn't. If you have a story like that, and I think most of you do if you're honest about it, I want you to write it down. Put it in the comments. Not for me. For the person reading the comments who needs to know they weren't the only one. It might just become the next story I tell. Let's go back to the story. The 10th day was a Saturday. Enoch made a plan. His plan was this. He would walk the trail south, past the dry creek bed, past the second creek if there was one, and he would leave a continuous chain of survey flags, one every 50 feet, tied to branches and rocks and stakes. He would measure the full length with his chain. He would note every switchback. Then he would turn around and walk back and he would count the flags and he would know, finally, whether the trail changed or whether his counting changed. He would bring Willard to wait at the trailhead. He would bring Bess. He would go in the morning in full daylight and be back by noon. That was the plan. A good plan. The kind a careful man makes when he's trying to be careful about something that doesn't care about careful. Willard came. He stood at the trailhead with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he said, "You go in, you come out by noon. If you're not out by noon, I'm coming in after you." Enoch agreed. Bess sat at the trailhead, and this time she didn't whine. She was quiet, and her quiet was worse than her whine. The way silence from a thing that usually makes noise is always worse. Enoch went in at 7 in the morning. He walked south. He tied flags every 50 feet. He counted switchbacks. 7. He measured with the chain. 230 feet to the dry creek bed. He crossed the dry creek bed. He continued south. The trail continued. It descended further, deeper into the ravine, and the canopy thickened until the light was green and dim and underwater. The rhododendron pressed in from both sides, and the air smelled of wet stone and something else. Something Enoch couldn't name. Something old and mineral and close. He tied his flags. He measured his chain. He walked for what he estimated was 20 minutes past the dry creek bed, and then he heard water. Not the sound of a distant creek. The sound of water close, immediate, as if he were standing beside it. He looked around. There was no water. The ground was dry. The creek bed behind him was dry. But the sound was there, clear and distinct, the sound of running water over stones, and it sounded like it was 3 feet to his left. He walked toward the sound. 3 steps. 4. The sound stayed 3 feet to his left, always just past his reach. He stopped. The sound stopped. He took a step. The sound resumed. The second creek was there. Asaph's grandmother had been right. It was a running creek, clear water, shallow, running over smooth stones in a bed that was no more than 2 feet wide. The water ran south. Enoch knelt beside it and cupped water in his hands and drank. It was the coldest water he'd ever tasted. Colder than the air, colder than the stone, the kind of cold that belongs to something underground. He looked at his compass. The needle was spinning. Not swinging, but spinning, slow and steady, like the hand of a clock running out. It completed 2 full rotations and kept going. He stood up. He looked at his watch. It was 9:15. He'd been walking for 2 hours and 15 minutes. He'd estimated 20 minutes. His watch said 2 hours and 15 minutes, and the trail was the same trail, the same ground, and he had not been walking for 2 hours. He tied a flag to a stone beside the second creek. He wrote in his book, "Second creek confirmed. Water running south. Compass rotating. Watch reads 9:15. Walking time inconsistent." He turned around. That was the turn. The trail knew. Asaf's grandmother had said it, and Enoch had understood the words but not the weight of them. Not until he turned around and saw the trail behind him. The same rhododendron, the same dim green light, and felt something shift. The flags were there. He could see the nearest one, 30 feet back, red cloth on a branch. He walked toward it. He reached it. He counted it. 1. He walked to the next. 2. He walked to the third. The third flag was there, but it was on the wrong side of the trail. He'd tied it to the right side going down. It was on the left now. 4. 5. The fifth flag was in the rhododendron, 5 feet off the trail. 6. The sixth flag was gone. 7. The seventh was there, but the trail between it and the sixth had an extra bend, a switchback that hadn't existed going down. He counted. He measured. He checked his watch. It was 10:40. He'd been walking back for an hour and 25 minutes. He hadn't reached the dry creek bed yet. Going down, the dry creek bed had been 230 feet from the trailhead. He'd been walking for an hour and 25 minutes and he hadn't covered 230 feet. 7 going down. 11 coming back. The rhododendron was thicker. The trail was narrower. The light was dimmer. He could hear the water again, the phantom water always 3 feet to his left. His compass was still spinning. His watch was still running, but the minutes were going faster than they should, or he was walking slower, or the trail was longer, and there was no way to tell which. He walked faster. The trail didn't get shorter. He walked slower. The trail didn't change. He stopped and sat on a stone and opened his survey book and wrote, September 14th, 1912. Walking north on Pinewood Trace. Have been walking north for approximately 2 hours. Have not reached dry creek bed. Trail length inconsistent. Flags missing or displaced. Compass non-functional. Sound of water present. No source visible. AM going to continue north. He continued north. At noon, Willard Coots stood at the trailhead and looked into the gap and listened. The woods were quiet. The light was flat and gray. He looked at Bess. Bess was standing at the gap, her head low, her ears forward, not moving, not making any sound, and Willard thought that was the worst thing he'd ever seen a dog do. Because a dog that's afraid will whine or growl, but a dog that's given up is just quiet. Enoch, Willard called. His voice went into the gap and didn't come back. That wasn't right. Sound should bounce in those mountains. It should come back off the ridge. His voice went in and stayed there, as if the trail had swallowed it. He waited until 1. He waited until 2. At 2:15, he took 3 steps into the gap and stopped, because the air inside was different. Colder. The kind of cold that doesn't belong to the season. Carrying a smell Willard knew in his body before his mind. Wet stone, and beneath it, something old, something that had been in the ground a long time. He backed out. He pulled Bess away by the collar and walked down to the general store in Mount Sterling and told the men that Enoch hadn't come out. The men went quiet and one of them, Jess Watkins, 45, a short, powerfully built man with a black beard and one blind eye, the other a sharp, pale gray, said, I told him. I told him about that trace. He wouldn't listen. Nobody went in after Enoch. Not that day. Not the next. They talked about it at the store and at the church and in the cabins along Pinewood Creek, and they talked about it the way you talk about a death that hasn't been confirmed, carefully, respectfully, with the door left open just in case. But nobody went in. The 12th day was a Monday. Marion Saylor, 34, came to Mount Sterling. She came on foot, walking the 7 miles from the cabin on Pinewood Creek, and she came wearing her father's coat because it was cold for September and because the coat smelled like Harlan and she needed something that smelled like Harlan right now. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. She stood in the general store with her hands in her pockets and her jaw set and she said, My brother is on that trail. I want him brought out. Nobody said anything for a long time, And then Asaph Cruz, who had walked in behind Marion unnoticed, tapped his hickory stick against the doorframe and said, "I'll go to the trailhead with you. I won't go in, but I'll go to the trailhead." Marion said, "That's not enough." Asaph said, "I know it isn't." They went. 7 men went, and Asaph and Marianne and Bess, who had been staying at Willard's cabin and who walked at Marianne's heel now as if she transferred her loyalty, which she had, which dogs do when the person they've chosen doesn't come back. They walked up Pinewood Creek to the gap in the rhododendron, and they stood there, and the gap was the same as it had always been, narrow, dark, the ground smooth and bare inside it, the light coming through in coins and strips. Asaph stood at the gap for a long time. He didn't go in. He stood with his hat in his hand and his pale blue eyes watering in the cold, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and old Enoch Saylor, "If you can hear me, turn around and walk north. Count your steps. Don't count the switchbacks. Don't count the flags. Count your steps and walk north and don't stop walking north." His voice went into the gap. It went in the way Willard's voice had gone in. Swallowed, absorbed, taken into the dark and not given back. The rhododendron didn't move. The air in the gap was cold and still and smelled of wet stone. Nobody came out. They waited an hour. Marion stood at the gap and didn't sit down and didn't move and didn't cry. The men stood behind her and didn't know what to do with their hands. Bess lay at the gap and put her chin on her paws and watched the dark, the same way she'd done 12 days ago, the same posture, the same stillness, and Willard thought that was the second worst thing he'd ever seen a dog do, because it meant she was still waiting, and waiting for a dog is a kind of hope, and hope for a dog that has already given up is the cruelest thing. At 4 o'clock, Asaph said, "He's not coming out today." He said it the way a doctor says a thing. Not cruel, not gentle, just factual, just the words laid down on the table like a stone. Marion nodded. She didn't speak. She turned around and walked back down the mountain, and the men followed her, and Bess followed Marianne, and the gap in the rhododendron stayed open behind them, the way it always did, the way it always would. The county searched. That was the word they used, searched, though what they did was stand at the trailhead and call Enoch's name and listen to their voices go in and not come back. County Surveyor Hiram Bethune, 52, tall and angular with a gray mustache and spectacles, came up from Waynesville with 2 deputies and a map. He looked at the gap. He looked at the map. He looked at the gap again. "The trail isn't on the county map," Hiram said. "It's referenced in the 1847 deed book, but it was never surveyed. There's no official record of it. No length, no bearing, no terminus. As far as the county is concerned, this trail doesn't exist." "It exists," Willard said. "I don't doubt that. I'm telling you what the records say. The records say this trail was vacated in 1847. No cause recorded. No petition. No survey. It was stricken. There's nothing for me to search. There's no trail on my map." Hiram Bethune went back to Waynesville. He filed a missing persons report for Enoch Saylor, assistant surveyor, age 31, last seen September 14, 1912, on Pinewood Creek. The report was filed and recorded and put in a drawer, and that was the extent of what the county could do, because the county could not search a trail that didn't exist on any map, and the county could not send men into a gap in the rhododendron that swallowed their voices, and the county, in the end, was an instrument that could only measure what it could see, and this was something it could not see. Marianne went to the courthouse in Waynesville in October. She went to the Register of Deeds, Corporal Bunyan, 47, bald, soft-handed, a man who had never walked a mountain trail, and she asked him to pull the records for the Pinewood Trace. He pulled the deed book, the survey records, the trail registry, and laid them on the counter. "Ma'am, there's nothing here. The trail was vacated. No survey, no plat, no bearing, no length. Just a margin note. Trail vacated. No cause recorded. Who vacated it? No one knows. There's no name. There's no petition. There's just the note. It was entered by the county clerk at the time, a man named Gilmer Haynes. Marion looked at him. Gilmer Haynes was the surveyor who went in and didn't come out. Corporal Bunyan looked at her over his spectacles. "Then who entered the note?" She didn't answer. There was no answer. The note was in the deed book, in handwriting identified as Gilmer Haynes's, and Gilmer Haynes had gone into the trail and hadn't come out, and the note was dated 3 days after he went in. He'd written it after he went in. Or the trail had written it. Or it had always been there, and no one had thought to question it because no one questioned things in deed books in 1847. Marian went home to the cabin on Pinewood Creek and she sat with her father, Harlan, who was 68 and losing his memory and who didn't fully understand what had happened, who kept asking where Enoch was and then forgetting. She held his trembling hand and didn't tell him the details, because the details would have broken something already cracking. She just said, "He's on a long walk, Papa. He'll be back when he's back." Harlan nodded. He looked at the door. He said he always did walk too far. And then his eyes went soft and distant, and whatever else he'd been about to say was gone. October came, and the leaves turned, and the mountains burned red and gold, and the gap in the rhododendron stayed open. Bess stopped eating on the third day after the search. She lay at the cabin door and wouldn't move, and Marian brought her water and broth, and Bess drank the water but not the broth. And on the fifth day she got up and walked to the gap in the rhododendron and lay down there, and Marian let her, because what do you do with a dog that's waiting for someone who isn't coming back? You let her wait. You bring her food and water. And you hope the faithfulness of it means something. Bess lived. She lived through October, through November, through the winter, sleeping at the gap, eating what Marian brought, drinking from Pinewood Creek. She lived through snow and bitter cold with a stubbornness that made Willard Coots shake his head. She was thin. Her gray muzzle went whiter. But she lived and she stayed and she watched the gap. In the spring of 1913, Marian found Enoch's survey book. Not at the gap, at the cabin. It was in Enoch's room on the shelf where he kept his equipment, and it was open, and the last entry was dated September 14, 1912, and it read the way Enoch's entries always read: careful, precise, the handwriting of a man who trusted numbers. But the last page was different. The last page was written in a hand that was Enoch's but not Enoch's. The same letters, the same slant, but larger, looser, as if the hand that wrote it had more room than it needed, as if the hand that wrote it had been writing for a very long time. The last page read, September 14th. Still walking north. Counting steps. Have counted 40,000 steps. Trail has not ended. Switchbacks now 23. Flags gone. Compass still turning. Water sound continuous. Left side. Can see the gap. Can see the gap from here. Can see the light. AM walking toward the light. Steps are not covering distance. AM not getting closer. 7 going down. That was all. 7 going down. No 11 coming back. No final note. Just the incantatory phrase, half finished, the way a prayer is half finished when the person praying runs out of breath. Marian read it standing in Enoch's room with the window light on the page and the spring air coming through the screen and the creek running outside, and she read it twice, and she folded the book closed and held it against her chest, and she stood there for a long time, breathing, just breathing, and then she put the book back on the shelf where she'd found it, and she went outside and she fed Bess, and she didn't tell anyone what she'd read for 6 years. Harlan Saylor died in the winter of 1914. He was 70. He died in the cabin on Pinewood Creek with Marian beside him, and in his last days his memory came back, the way it sometimes does, a final clearing, a last bright window before the dark. He was clear for 3 days, and on the second of those days he said, "I walked that trail with your mother. Before you were born. She made me turn around at the first bend. She said, 'Not this one, Harlan. Not this one.' And I listened. I always listened to her. Enoch didn't listen. Enoch was like me before your mother. He wanted to know. He wanted to know what was past the bend. I stopped wanting to know. That's the only reason I'm here." He died on a Thursday. The funeral was at the Pinewood Chapel, a small frame church with a cemetery on the hill behind it, and Asaph Cruz preached the service, and he preached it well, and he said nothing about the trail, because a funeral is not the place for that, because a funeral is the place for grief and for the small, kind lives that grief needs, and Asaph knew the difference. Marian kept the cabin. She kept it for 40 years. She never married, though she was asked by good men, men who would have been kind to her. She kept the cabin, and she kept the garden, and she kept the creek, and she kept Bess, who lived to be 17, which was old for a bluetick, which was old for any dog, and who spent every one of those years at the gap in the rhododendron, coming home for food and water and warmth in the worst of the winter, but always going back, always lying at the trailhead with her chin on her paws, watching the dark. When Bess died, in the spring of 1921, Marian buried her at the gap. She dug the grave herself in the rocky soil beside the rhododendron, and she wrapped Bess in a quilt. The same quilt Enoch had used on cold nights in the survey camp, a scrap quilt their mother had made, blues and grays and browns, the colors of the mountains, and she laid her in the ground and she covered her, and she didn't mark the grave with a stone, because stones can be moved, and she didn't mark it with a name, because names can be forgotten. She marked it by planting a rhododendron at the head of the grave, a small one, barely a cutting, taken from the bush at the gap, and she watered it and she waited for it to grow. The rhododendron grew, slowly, until it became part of the gap, part of the wall of green that framed the trailhead. But Marian knew. She went to the gap every morning for 40 years at dawn, in the gray half-light before the sun came over the ridge, and she stood at the trailhead and said, quietly, in a voice that was barely a voice, more a murmur, more a breath with words in it, Enoch. It's morning. You can come home now. She said it every morning, in the rain and the snow and the heat of August and the cold of February. She said it when she was young and when she was old, when her hair was gray and her hands shook the way her father's had shaken, and she never raised her voice, because the trail was right there, and if he could hear her at a murmur, and if he couldn't, then volume wouldn't help. She said it for 40 years. He never came out. The trail never closed. The gap in the rhododendron stayed open, season after season, year after year, the ground inside it smooth and bare and leaf-covered, the light coming through in coins and strips, and the air inside it always colder than the air outside it, and the smell of wet stone always present, faint, barely there, like a memory of a memory. In 1952, Marianne was 74. She walked to the gap on a Tuesday morning in October, the same as always, and she stood at the trailhead and she said her morning words, Enoch. It's morning. You can come home now. And then she did something she'd never done before. She stepped into the gap. She took one step over the threshold, onto the smooth bare ground, into the cold air that smelled of wet stone. She stood there for 30 seconds. She stood there with her eyes open and her hands at her sides and her gray hair loose and her trembling hands still. She stood there and she looked down the trail into the dim green light, into the rhododendron, and she saw, or she thought she saw, or she wanted to see, or the trail wanted her to see. A flicker of red. A red survey flag, tied to a branch, far down the trail, far enough that it could have been a bird or a leaf or the last color of autumn caught in the canopy. But she saw it. She saw it, and she stepped back out of the gap, and she went home, and she never went back. She told no one about the red flag. She told no one about the step. She died in 1957, at 79, in the cabin on Pinewood Creek, in the bed where she'd been born. The cabin passed to a cousin's son who sold it to the Park Service when the Great Smoky Mountains National Park expanded in the 1960s. The trail isn't on any Park Service map. I checked. I drove to the Oconaluftee Visitor Center and the rangers pulled every trail register and backcountry map and historical inventory. There is no Pinewood Trace. There is a gap in the rhododendron on the north side of Pinewood Creek, just past where the creek bends east, and the Park Service has it listed as a natural drainage feature. A place where water has worn a path through the brush. A drainage feature, not a trail. A trail, after all, has to go somewhere, and this one, according to every official measurement, doesn't. But if you walk Pinewood Creek on a cold morning in October, when the leaves are down and the light is flat, you can find the gap. Still there. The rhododendron has grown around it and over it in the 112 years since Enoch Saylor walked in, but the gap is there and the ground inside it is smooth and bare, and if you stand at the edge and listen, you can hear something. It might be water. It might be wind. It might be the creek, bending sound the way creeks do in those mountains. Or it might be something else. I stood there for 20 minutes on a Tuesday morning in October and listened, and what I heard was the sound of someone walking, far away, steady, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who has been walking for a very long time and has not yet arrived. And every once in a while, if you're quiet enough, and the wind is right, you can hear something beneath the footsteps. A voice, low, murmuring, a woman's voice, saying the same thing over and over, the way a stone wears smooth in a creek. Enoch, it's morning. You can come home now. I don't know what's on that trail. I don't know if Enoch Saylor is still walking it, or if the trail ended long ago and what's left is the echo of a man who counted his steps until the counting became the walking. I don't know if Gilmer Haynes is still walking it, or Standing Deer, or Jackson Blevins, or the others whose names were never recorded. I don't know if the trail is a thing or a place or a process, something the mountain does to people who walk too far. Some things are not for knowing. Some things are for telling. And the telling is enough. There's a story I've been sitting with. It came to me from a woman in eastern Kentucky in the hills above Prestonsburg, and it's about a well that was dug on a farm in 1906 and capped the same year it was dug, and the reason it was capped was carved into the capstone, and the reason was only 4 words long, and nobody in that family has ever said those 4 words out loud. I'm going to tell that story soon. I'm still sitting with it. But it's coming. If you've got a story, one your family doesn't talk about, one your grandmother whispered once and then pretended she hadn't, one that lives in the silence between the things people will say and the things they won't, I want you to write it down. Put it in the comments. I read every one of them. It might just become the next story I tell, the way the ones before it became the ones I've already told, the way this one became this one, found in a deed book, folded inside a margin note, waiting for someone to hold it at an angle to the window and read. Some trails don't want to be found. Some trails don't want to be followed. And some trails, once you've turned around, don't want to let you leave. If you ever find yourself on one, if the footing is good and the air is wrong and the path behind you has more bends than it had going in, turn around while you still can. Count your steps. Don't count the switchbacks. Walk north. And whatever you do, don't stop walking. Mind the gap.